Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive.
We always get into these really fascinating topics.
And today is no exception, right? We're
Yeah.
going to be tackling secularism
Yes.
and specifically kind of looking at it through the lens of how it plays out in India.
And to help us unpack all of this.
We've got this academic chapter we're going to be diving into.
Right.
And it really doesn't beat around the bush.
It jumps right into some intense examples of religious discrimination right from the start.
Yeah.
Talking about things like the 1984 Sikh massacre.
The displacement of Kashmiri Pandits, the 2002 Gujarat riots.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that this concept we're talking about, it's not just theoretical.
Right.
It has real world and, tragic consequences.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that,
Achieving a society where these things don't happen.
Right.
It's not as simple as just being like, oh, everyone be tolerant.
Exactly.
The chapter really digs into this idea that true secularism, it goes beyond just mere tolerance, right? Tolerance can sometimes feel a bit like, I don't know, like you're just putting up with something you dislike.
Right.
Whereas secularism, at least as this chapter presents it.
It recognizes the inherent complexity of human suffering.
Right.
And it kind of acknowledges that religion is one response to that suffering.
So it's not about erasing faith.
But more about understanding its place in the broader human experience.
Precisely. And that understanding is going to be so crucial when we start to look at what the chapter calls intra-religious domination.
Okay, intra-religious domination. That's a new one for me.
Break that down. What are we talking about there?
So think about it this way. Secularism. It's not just about different religions coexisting peacefully,
Right.
It's also about recognizing that even within a religion, there can be these power struggles and the potential for discrimination.
So you're looking at those power dynamics.
Those imbalances, but within the religions themselves.
Right.
Okay, so it's like a whole other layer to this.
It is. It has a whole other dimension. I hadn't considered that, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me as I was going through this chapter
is how it contrasts the Western model of secularism
with the Indian model.
Yeah.
And it's almost like they're coming from, it's like two totally different.
It's like they're speaking different languages almost.
Absolutely.
The Western model, with its whole emphasis on the separation of church and state.
Right.
That comes from a very specific historical context.
Okay.
Right. Imagine a society where there's one dominant religion.
Right.
And you can see how the focus might become like, how do we prevent the church from having too much influence on the state?
Right. Like a hard line in the sand. You stay over there. You stay over there.
Exactly.
Don't even think about crossing over.
Exactly.
But then you go to a place like India.
And that wouldn't fly at all, would it?
No, not at all.
Because India, they have this long and rich history of religious diversity.
Right.
It's not just about keeping religions separate. It's like, how do you manage its presence within this incredibly diverse society?
So how does that work? How does the Indian model approach this?
Well, it's really interesting, and the chapter really emphasizes that the Indian model is not just a copycat of the Western model.
Okay.
It's something that has evolved organically from India's unique social fabric.
And then you also have the arrival of Western ideas about equality, right?
Okay.
Which further enriched this model, pushing for not just what we might call interreligious equality, but also that interreligious equality we were talking about.
Oh, right, right.
So making sure that all voices are heard.
Exactly.
Not just across different faiths, but within those faiths as well.
Yeah, and this is where the concept of principal distance comes in.
Okay, principal distance. We got to talk about that.
Yes.
Because it feels like that's a key to understanding
it's essential.
how this Indian model actually functions.
Yes.
So what's the essence of this idea?
Okay, so imagine it this way.
The Indian state, it's like this respectful observer, right?
Yeah. It's acknowledging the importance of religious freedom for all.
Okay.
But here's the thing, this observer, it's not passive.
Right.
If there's a situation where a religious practice is infringing upon the fundamental rights of an individual or a group, the state is going to step in.
So it's finding that balance.
Between respecting religious autonomy.
But also making sure that everyone is treated equally.
Precisely.
And the chapter even gives some really concrete examples.
Okay.
Like the banning of untouchability, legal reforms regarding dowry and child marriage.
Right.
These are instances where the state had to intervene to uphold the rights of those who are being marginalized, often within their own religious communities.
So it's a very different approach.
Than just saying, oh, religion's a private matter, we're not going to get involved.
It's a much more nuanced approach.
Yeah.
It recognizes that sometimes to ensure that everyone has the freedom of religion.
You can't just sit on the sidelines.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to engage. It makes you wonder how that's, like, how's that gone?
How's that approach fared?
Well, that's a great question.
Because you can imagine it's definitely opened up the door for debate and even some criticism.
Yeah.
In fact, the chapter goes on to highlight 6 major criticisms.
6. Wow.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got to unpack those.
We'll dive into those.
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
6 major criticisms. Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It really is. So where do we even start with this?
Well, the chapter begins with what you might say is the most common critique,
Okay.
which is this idea that secularism is basically like anti-religion.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
Right. But the chapter pushes back on that. You know,
Yeah.
it's saying, hold on a second, that's a misunderstanding of what we're talking about here.
Okay.
It argues that secularism, it isn't about being against faith itself.
Right.
It's more about making sure that no one religion is calling the shots.
Right.
You know, having dominance over other religions or even over those who don't subscribe to any religion at all.
So, like, you could be a very devout person
Absolutely.
of whatever faith, but still believe in the principles of a secular state.
Exactly. It's about protecting the right of each individual to practice their faith freely without fear of being forced or discriminated against, but also respecting the rights of those who choose a different path, right?
It's about coexistence.
Yeah, finding a way for these things to exist side by side respectfully.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily this, like, versus...
Right. It's not secularism versus religion.
Right, it's finding that balance.
Yeah, finding a way for these things to work together.
Okay, that makes sense.
Another big critique the chapter digs into is this whole idea that secularism is something that's been, like, imposed on India, that it's a Western import.
Right, you hear that a lot too.
Oh, yeah, and the chapter acknowledges that.
Okay.
It acknowledges that, you know, Western thought has had an influence, right? I mean, on how secularism has developed globally.
Right.
But it pushes back on this idea that it's just this foreign thing that's being forced on India.
Right, that it's like a cut and paste.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're just going to ignore centuries of history here.
Right.
And the chapter talks about India's long tradition of diverse religious communities living together.
Right.
Interacting, influencing each other.
Right, like it's always been this melting pot.
Exactly. And it suggests that Indian secularism is much more of a dialogue.
Okay.
It's like a blending of these pre-existing values with those Western ideals of equality we were just talking about.
So it's not about saying, let's wipe the slate clean and start over.
No, not at all.
It's how do we take what's already here and then...
Right. It's incorporating those global ideas.
Yeah, and find a way to make it all.
Right, to make it work in the specific context.
Yeah, okay, so it's very much rooted in its own history.
Absolutely.
Okay. The chapter also talks about this whole concept of minoritism.
Yes, minoritism. That's a big one.
Which it feels like that's a term that's been used not always in the most positive light, I guess.
Right. It can definitely be a loaded term.
So what's the chapter's take on all that?
It encourages us to think about minority rights not as special privileges, but as safeguards that are essential for equality. And it uses this really interesting analogy of a non-smoker on a train.
Okay, a train full of smokers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm listening. How does that work?
So picture this. You're on this train.
Okay.
And it's full of smokers.
Right.
And let's say we put it to a vote, smoking allowed or not allowed.
Right. Democracy in action.
Exactly. But what if you're that one non-smoker, and let's say you even have a medical condition where the smoke is really dangerous for you?
Right. Suddenly it's not just about a preference, you know.
Exactly. And that's the point the chapter is trying to make.
Okay.
Sometimes when it comes to fundamental rights, when we're talking about potential harm, just going with what the majority wants, that's not always enough.
Right. It's about protecting, like you said, those fundamental rights.
Exactly. Sometimes you have to protect the rights of the few, even if it means going against the wishes of the many.
To ensure a just society.
Exactly. That's what it all comes down to.
Okay, so I can see how that analogy really...
kind of highlights the complexity of it all.
It illustrates it perfectly, right?
Yeah.
Because you want to respect individual rights, but then you have the needs of the group.
Right. So how do you balance that?
And that's the tightrope that Indian secularism is trying to walk, right?
Oh, okay.
Because on the other side of the coin, you have this criticism that it's too interventionist.
Right. It's too involved.
Right. That by trying to protect minority rights, it's stepping on the toes of religious freedom for some communities.
So it's like, where do you draw that line?
Exactly.
How do you, how much do you get involved and how much do you step back?
And the chapter gives this really interesting example of personal law reform in India.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
It is, and it's a sensitive issue for sure.
Because you've got all these different religious communities with their own sets of laws and traditions, and then...
Right, so where does the state fit in?
Right, where do they draw the line there?
It's tough. And the chapter suggests that a truly secular state would strive to reform these laws in a way that ensures fundamental rights for all.
Right, which is, like, that's not an easy task.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And it emphasizes that the state needs to be more like a facilitator.
Okay.
Encouraging conversation, finding solutions that work for everyone.
So it's not about dictating,
right,
but more about bringing people together.
Exactly. Finding common ground.
And finding solutions.
Yeah, working together to figure out how to navigate this complex landscape.
Okay, so it's very much a balancing act.
Always a balancing act.
And that leads us to, I guess, kind of a more grounded criticism, which is the whole idea of vote bank politics.
Ah, yes, vote bank politics. We can't forget about that.
Right, that always seems to come up, especially,
Especially during elections.
Right, exactly.
It's like clockwork.
Right. So how does this chapter tackle that one?
It's interesting because it doesn't shy away from saying, yeah, you know what? This happens.
Okay.
Like, it acknowledges that secularism can be, and sometimes is, used for political gain.
Right, so it's not like this pure ideal that's above...
Exactly. It's not immune to that.
Right.
But it doesn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay.
Because it argues that the problem isn't so much about politicians trying to get the support of specific groups.
Because that's kind of how it works, right?
Right. That's democracy in action to some extent.
Right.
The issue arises when those politicians, they're all talk and no action.
Right, when they say one thing and do another.
Exactly. When they prioritize short-term gains, like winning an election.
Right, over the long game.
Yeah, over actually governing in a way that benefits everyone.
Right, so it's about genuine representation versus just paying lip service.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final criticism, which some might say is the most cynical one.
Okay, and what's that?
This idea of secularism being an impossible project.
Impossible project, huh?
Yeah, it's almost like they're saying it's a nice thought.
Right, but it's never actually going to work out in the real world.
Exactly. That is this utopian vision.
Right, that sounds good on paper, but when you actually look at...
Actually pulling it off.
Yeah, so how does the chapter...
Because that's kind of depressing, right?
It is a bit of a downer.
So how do they respond to that?
Well, it points to India itself as proof that it's not impossible.
Okay.
Look at their history, centuries of all these diverse religious groups coexisting.
Right.
Yeah, and sure, it hasn't always been perfect.
But they've managed to hold on to that secular fabric.
Right.
Even with all the modernization and changes they've gone through.
So it's like they're saying, don't just, dismiss it out of hand.
Right, exactly.
Look at the evidence.
Don't underestimate us. We've been doing this.
Right, we've got a track record here.
Exactly.
But it also, the chapter acknowledges that the world is very different than it used to be.
Oh, absolutely. The world is more interconnected than ever, right?
Right, and these challenges to secularism, whether it's religious fundamentalism or political polarization.
Yeah, you see it everywhere.
It's not just an India thing anymore.
No, it's a global issue.
Right, and so the chapter kind of leaves us with this question.
Well, it's more like a really big, thought-provoking question.
Okay, yeah.
Says, can a state truly treat all religions equally, or does it have to get involved sometimes to ensure broader equality?
It's that question of how much is too much.
Exactly. Because on the one hand...
You want the state to be neutral. Right.
Respecting everyone's freedom.
Yeah, everyone gets to practice their faith, no problem, but...
But then sometimes those practices might clash with, equality for individuals.
Yeah, what happens when those internal rules bump up against those bigger ideas of justice and fairness for everyone?
Yeah, it's like, how do you...
It's tricky.
Yeah, how do you even begin to answer that?
It's one of those questions that could be debated endlessly.
Right. And there's no easy answer, it seems like, every situation.
It's case by case.
Yeah, it requires a lot of thought and dialogue.
It does, and I think that's a sign of a really great deep dive.
Okay.
When the conversation doesn't just end when the episode's over.
Right.
It sparks new questions.
Right. It gets you thinking.
It makes you want to go out and explore these ideas further.
Exactly. So, to all our listeners out there,
we want to hear from you.
What are your thoughts on all this?
This idea of secularism.
Especially as it's playing out in India.
Head over to our website. Share your thoughts in the comments.
We'd love to keep this conversation going.
And until next time,
keep diving deep.